The Quaker peace testimony is just one part of an entire worldview of Quakers called testimony. Now, the meaning of testimony has evolved over centuries, yet still retains its original meaning of witness, a consistent body of words about faith and action, not only what Quakers say, but what they do and how they live individually and corporately. Thus, testimony puts belief into action, and over time, the collected experience of Quakers performing their beliefs in action develops into, one could say, an accumulation or a corporate expression of a shared faith. This would be akin to testimony in a courtroom. Quaker testimony is the way that Quakers speak to the world, telling the truth about who God is and how God desires us to act. Therefore, testimony is both the core principles, theology, and values of Quakers, as well as the actions which Quakers do as a result of those core principles and theological concepts. Now, certain core ideas have emerged over time with regards to testimony. They have been expressed in various, often widely various ways through Quaker history. It can be understood to speak to beliefs which have either always been present in Quakerism or which have evolved from ideas which were already existing within Quakerism in other ways, but hadn't specifically been labeled this specific idea before. Individual testimonies are social expressions of spiritual realities, concepts which emerged from Quaker worship, but which have been expressed in the ways which Quakers lived out the truth they experienced when they were actually in worship. There is no one set, established list of testimonies which all Quakers everywhere agree upon, but some are more consistently accepted than others. There's 6 characteristics of testimony as an idea, and also applies to testimonies which have been derived from this overarching idea of testimony. 1, it has to be integral to Quaker faith. It can never be optional. 2, comes from spiritual convincement, deep within, meaning that this is something that somebody has experienced in worship or in connection to the divine, and they've been convinced of its truthfulness. 3, at their deepest level, testimonies are positive, meaning that they seek to do things, even when they seem to be negatively against a thing. 4, they are absolute, and they are not conditional or contextual. They do not change, even if how they are expressed may change. 5, they must be lived in daily life. 6, they are a means of engaging with the world and not withdrawing or separating from the world. Now, the Quaker peace testimony was originally just a statement against war. And this arose from the context of early Quakerism. During the English Civil War in about 1640 to 1660 is the time frame we'll be talking about, a mass movement arose which sought to both reform the structure of English society and expand the place of Protestantism in English religious life. This resulted in a wide variety of various groups emphasizing both the equality of all people before God, and thus the necessity of destroying the monarchy and most other social and political hierarchies, as well as the ability of all people to access God and understand the Bible, and thus the need to abolish the clergy and empower all people to interpret the Bible for themselves. A large number of groups emerged from this truly chaotic time. Not many stayed around for as long as Quakers have. Quakerism thus makes sense in its context, in this ferment, in this time of significant rejection of previous core ideas of hierarchy and the place of humanity in the whole state of the world. What differs from these other groups, however, is that Quakerism rejected the use of violence, as war was just one of the numerous lusts which could distract people from living the life that Jesus called people to lead. The first time that this principle was explicitly stated by Quakers was in 1661, as a way of distancing Quakers from other groups who sought the violent overthrow of the monarchy, and thus, by doing this, demonstrating that King Charles II, who had just returned and just reestablished the English monarchy after the long English Civil War, that Quakers weren't dangerous and didn't need to be destroyed by the king. Now, while this statement emerged because of necessity, it actually spoke to principles which had already coalesced in Quaker belief and practice. This was initially mainly a testimony against war, which sought to both eliminate war and to create barriers between Quakers and the areas of society which could be used by the government to assist in waging war. It was a negative in that it was a rejection of war and anything that's connected to it, but it was mainly a positive in that it sought to develop a form of life for Quakers which stressed life and obedience to God's call to respond to evil and violence with love and compassion. Now, this developed into a complex framework of prohibited behaviors over time and beliefs which granted their community cohesion and connectedness. This wasn't a monolith, though, where all Quakers walked in lockstep to the pacifist vision. Quakers consistently engaged in debate about what constituted war and where the boundaries were between supporting war and aiding those in the path of war who just happened to be harmed. As a result, Quakers participated in numerous American and British wars through the 20th century at various levels of support. Yet, oftentimes, these actions were quite controversial for their specific communities they emerged from. Now, conscientious objection to war as an idea eventually developed and got rooted in government policy by World War II. And this was three separate types. One, you could be a non-combatant serving in the military, somebody who was responsible for being a cook or for playing music or being involved in any of the activities which aided in the actual fighting of the war, but not ever actually holding a weapon. Two, alternative service engaging in work of social value, not in the military, and this could be particularly in the time of World War II. This was service on helping at mental health hospitals. They were people who were engaged in a lot of highway cleanup, highway construction, those kinds of things that the government needed people to do. And three, absolute objectors claiming a complete exemption from any work which could in any way contribute to the nation's war effort. Now, three was the least popular in terms of number of people who were engaged in that way of thinking idea. And many of those who had that idea rooted their objections in an absolute Christian pacifism. Quaker pacifism fell somewhere between 2 and 3. Now, Quaker organizations, which developed in response to the need for alternative service, took on an international character, both in response to, by this point, the worldwide spread of Quakerism, and also due to the international scope of war in the 20th century. All of these organizations sought to leverage the global scope of Quakerism alongside the peacemaking and humanitarian aid skills which had been developed over centuries of the Quaker testimony against war. This reflected a broadening in the definition of the Quaker peace testimony from just a testimony against war to a more expansive testimony for peace. Now, this can be presented in 5 broad shifts, which reflect the seismic changes which had also hit Quakerism from the time of its beginnings in the 1600s to this point of the mid-20th century. 1. This was a movement from a testimony against war to a Quaker peace testimony as an idea. So it's a testimony for peace and not specifically against war. It's more expansive. 2, this is from a Christian-based testimony against war and against violence to a Christian, universalist, and even non-religious based Quaker peace testimony, reflecting the theological diversity that had developed in Quakerism by the time of the mid-20th century. 3, this is from a prescriptive, meaning a required, obligatory thing that everyone must follow, to more of an individual option, which gave more freedom and leniency and space for Quakers to enact their peace testimony in a variety of different ways. 4, this moves from a focus on internal individual behavior, which you found in the 1800s, where people would individually engage in work, as opposed to what developed over time to more of an external focus on the world. So this was more of people engaged in work which was going to not just help those who were harmed by war, but also to set in place a lot of the ideas and humanitarian programs which could potentially lead to keeping war from happening in the first place. And finally, this is a reflection of a movement from a narrow vision of peace, which is basically a situation where you have war and then you don't have war, and that is peace. Quakers developed this vision of peace, which expanded from that rather limited idea to a much broader idea where peace is something which involves a much greater sense of justice and compassion, truthfulness in the government, trust and accountability from the government. Peace is a much broader idea than just the absence of actual violent conflict.